Good afternoon. My name is Ross Emmett, and I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in the Perspectives on Economic Liberty public series of lectures, hosted by the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty here at ASU. The Perspectives lecture series emerges from the Center's mission, which is to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. Our goal is to become a leader in research that affects liberty-enhancing policy and increases public and academic awareness of the history and philosophy of economic liberty. Today's lecture also contributes to a couple other goals of the Center, the first of which is leveraging our location here in Arizona and the American Southwest to consider topics of importance for self-governance across the Western Hemisphere. In this case, of course, property rights in Latin America compared to property rights here in the US. And second, based on academic research that engages potential policy changes by re-envisioning governance structures. Our speaker today is Gary Leibkap, Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management and the Department of Economics at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Gary grew up in Livingston, Montana, a small town in the Yellowstone River Valley about 25 miles from Bozeman, about 100 miles due north of Yellowstone. He comes by his interest in natural resource, naturally, one might say. He's back in Montana these days, living in Missoula in retirement, although he sounds from our conversation this afternoon like he's everywhere but Missoula, traveling around the world and the continental U.S. Speaking. Gary has served as a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a member of the Research Group of Political Institutions and Economic Policy at Harvard, a senior research fellow at the Hoover Institution in Stanford, and a fellow of the Cliometric Society. The Cliometric Society, for those of us on the inside, is people who study economic history using quantitative analysis. He was the Pitt Professor of American Institutions and History at Cambridge University and the Erskine Fellow at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. A consistent theme of Gary's research has been incentive problems that arise from poorly designed rights to access resources like water and land. Please join me in welcoming Gary to ASU to speak about the differences between property rights across North and South America and their impact on economic performance.
Well, it's great to be back in Arizona, especially coming from Montana. Montana in the winter looks good on posters, but to live there is something else. I'd forgotten that, actually. But we lived in Tucson for almost 25 years, and so very familiar with not only ASU, but just the dramatic growth and development of ASU. It's just astounding, frankly. Maybe not to you, you expected it all that time, but nevertheless, when you're an outsider and you come in, you say, "Whoa, this is really wonderful." So, nice to be back and to share some ideas. I'd like to, as much as possible, keep this my formal presentation short or shorter, so that we can have more discussion, because it's part of a larger study. Where we're actually trying to quantify and test some differences in economic outcomes between North and South America. And so let me begin and lay this out. For many of you, some of these early issues are going to be, I'm getting a weather warning, so maybe we need a boat. It's not the kind of thing I expected coming here. Let me just turn this on. For many of you, many of these issues of property rights and so forth will be old hat, and that's good. And for other of you, maybe less so. And then turning into differences in North and South America. in some ways are surprising. Certainly if you were from Mars and you were sort of moving around the planet at different times, you would have predicted, I think, different outcomes than what we observed possibly. And so I want to explore those, and then from a kind of a broader level, and then get into some of the tests that we're engaged in. And unfortunately, a big constraint, as many of you are aware, is data are key, and data sources are even more so. And but they're just not so many in the areas that we're looking at. So that kind of limits what we can actually test versus what we can sort of surmise from some of our outcomes. Okay, so. I'm interested really in differences in property rights regimes in North and South America and their colonial legacies. Okay, so this is going to be really important. It's the colonial legacy that we're testing, because there, as I'll show you in a moment, those are major differences even across similar climatic and terrain areas. So the colonial legacy is going to be different. Now, why property rights? As I said before, many of you, these would be old hat, but they are really, maybe it's because I've studied them for so long, but I actually do believe that they are the fundamental institution in any society. Okay? Who owns what determines who the decision makers are, their time frames, their incentives, the spread of those benefits and costs, and so they're fundamental. And a society that has one type of property rights is going to look very different from another society that has a different property rights regime, even controlling for resource endowment similarities and so forth. There are many kinds of property rights. Open access is one that the name alone lays out. It's the tragedy of the commons setting if the resource is valuable enough to invite competition. But basically, it's a resource that, for a variety of reasons, has no clear constraints on entry and use. If the resource is very valuable, it's a very expensive way for a society to manage resources, and we're sort of grappling with that today as some resources become increasingly valuable over time. There are small group property rights, group management, and this Lynn Ostrom, who was here at ASU and at Indiana, Nobel Prize in 2009, actually co-won it with my dissertation advisor, Oliver Williamson, who at the time was at Berkeley, but nevertheless, what Eleanor Ostrom and her students here as well have done is to look at how well small groups manage and can manage resource use in a way that avoids open access outcomes. Okay? And so this emphasizes homogeneity and sort of information and objectives with regard to the resource. And numbers have to be relatively small for all the reasons you might imagine, but certainly in terms of ensuring similarities and objectives and information about the status of the resource, and really the legitimacy of the constraints that are placed on access and use. Then there's state-owned. Essentially, it's a big group, very heterogeneous group, and so forth. That's socialism, and that's been around and gone and around and currently under in the political debate. And then there are a range of private property rights, some of those where they are broadly held and easily tradable, others where they are not so easily tradable for a variety of potential reasons, and more narrowly held. Okay? But each one of these property rights regimes has different implications for the nature of the society. Okay? The nature of the society in turn affects the kind of property rights regime. as we'll come back to. So there's this sort of circularity or endogeneity that make these studies, certainly at a cross-country or within-country region analysis, difficult. As I said, though, each type of property right has a different implication for how individuals behave and think about the resource and invest in the resource and trade the resource and think about time with regards to the resource's status. And so this ties into the center here in terms of notions of individual liberty, wealth accumulation, expectations for wealth accumulation, innovation, because innovation typically takes time to pay out. There's uncertainty. Who will engage in that? Well, if you have a claim over the potential benefits, then you're more likely to engage in those kinds of innovations than if your ownership or access is constrained. And then all of these, in turn, play out in terms of economic growth outcomes. Okay? Because it's in the aggregate, an innovative, dynamic society has different implications for long-term economic growth and measured in a variety of ways, than one where the ability to engage or incentive to engage in trade and in investment and ownership essentially differ. And this in turn feeds into political stability. Because if your expectations with regards to your welfare and your mobility, not only for you and for your family and your heirs, depend on your own responsibility and initiative, that's one thing. If instead it depends on your ties to or ability to influence the state to intervene, then that has a different outcome. And in terms of the latter, if the current political regime is not responsive, then you really have to organize and get another coalition together to change the government, and that has different implications for long-term political stability. And already, I hope you're starting to envision differences between North and South America. Now, economists have long examined the direct effects of differences in property regimes. Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize in, I think 1992 or thereabouts, was one of the early proponents of institutions and their impact on long-term economic growth with his research in trying to explain differences and outcomes in Western Europe, really, between England and the Netherlands and France and Spain, Portugal on the other. And then more recently, there have been a number of cross-country studies and within-country studies of differences in property rights institutions and how they can play out in terms of economic outcomes. And so these all tie back to incentives for investment, trade, production, innovation, and incorporating new information, okay? Because within a market, it really depends on differences in views of information, interpretation of information and what it means. So the most optimistic people compete away resources from less optimistic people typically. And then how those things play out have an important impact on society. These are hard to test, frankly. It's hard to get aggregate data. Aggregate data are aggregates. And, but nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that the outcomes of those research efforts are pretty uniform. That societies with the rule of law, with secure property rights, long-term property rights tend to have more advanced in terms of economic outcomes in almost any other measure of human welfare you can think of. Now, of course, there's endogeneity here because richer societies can afford to devote more resources to the rule of law and so forth. But nevertheless, controlling for those as best you can, I think the story is pretty clear. Secure property rights, private property rights, are associated with advances in economic growth and human welfare in a variety of ways. Now, these are all direct effects, and you could Google Scholar or Google for these kinds of outcomes and find, I think, a fair number of economic studies. If you were to look at a different literature, though, in a sense a more philosophical one, legal scholars, historians, and others tend to emphasize a related but somewhat different aspect of ownership. And that really is more of how people think of themselves in a society and how that leads to differences in behavior. Now, I pulled together some quotes to try to capture this because I don't even describe it very well. But certainly, if you go into English, the history of English common law, you have this quote from Blackstone, in the middle of the 18th century, of course, Thomas Jefferson's famous comment, and de Tocqueville in his touring of the early U.S. in the 1830s, and comparing it to what he was observing in Europe, in Western Europe at the time. And so I'll leave this for just a moment because I think they're so important for understanding what they thought was important about individuals' ownership, individual liberty, and incentives really for responsibility for their own welfare, and the importance of the market versus the state. Okay? And there actually have been some recent studies of de Tocqueville's arguments using more contemporary data. But essentially this captures the notion that people think of themselves differently. And this is a quote I like by John Steinbeck out of The Grapes of Wrath. Steinbeck was no big-time capitalist, as you probably know, but when he's describing the small farmers in Oklahoma at the time, he was discussing how important it was for them to own land, and in a way, what a tragedy it was that they were going to lose it with the advent of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. But if you boil this literature down, it tends to emphasize somewhat related but somewhat different points. Optimism, okay? You're still confronted with all sorts of things, no necessary safety nets or whatever, but there's an optimism that I'm really responsible for outcomes. Okay? And I actually have the ability to influence those outcomes to some degree. And as a consequence, if I fail, it is something I have done or something I could not control, the weather predominantly, but other natural plagues. And so it emphasizes self-reliance and really not so much blaming necessarily political competitors so much as my own lack of anticipation or expectation of bad weather or responding to it or so forth. So there is a fine line here, but nevertheless, in this literature that I said is more associated with kind of a philosophical notion or in historiography, there is a different set of attributes that are emphasized associated with land ownership. Okay? And I think this is very important when you read discussions of course, the American frontier, which I'll come back to in a moment, but Latin American and in particular South American frontiers. And if you abstract away from all the other places and just look at temperate parts of South America, now I can be wrong here because my Spanish is so weak as to be non-existent, but the point is my reading of the histories of frontiers in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, for example, nothing like Manifest Destiny or this sense of we're marching through to better our lives. There's just nothing in that in that discussion. But anyway, we'll come back to that and we can explore it more. Now, why property rights to land? You can own lots of things, but early in economic development, it's land that matters, and that land loosely covers all natural resources. Okay? But land is it, because in closely subsistence societies, it's what you produced in land is what got you by. Fisheries being another important aspect of this ability to deal with drought and other forms of natural disasters. But so land is a basic asset. Owners determine, landowners, because land is so important, they determine the economic, social, and political structure. Okay? So a place that is described or characterized by lots of small owners, then you'll get one situation as compared to a setting where it's dominated by large elites. Okay? And I'm going to emphasize that as we come into differences between North and South America. In medieval and even in contemporary less than in underperforming societies, land ownership tends to be held by elites. And of course, this was feudalism in medieval periods, but even so, there are long-term effects of land ownership by elites. Okay? These elites often are aligned with, because of their political influence, with the state. Okay? So the fine line between state ownership and elite land ownership is often blurred. Okay. That being said, for most of the population, there's very limited economic, social, and political liberty or opportunity for mobility. It's not only the fact that they don't own land, but they're not going to be able to own land. And in fact, no one wants them to own land because they want them to stick around within these feudal arrangements or near feudal arrangements. Okay? Because these settings rely a lot on relationships between large landowners and their children and those in political power and so forth. I'll come back to this in a moment. Relationships tend to be more static because markets don't deal with static. Markets deal with change and incorporating changes in value, at least held by some parties and participants, to essentially move things forward. And they're very damaging to relationships that mold economic, social, and political ties because they add uncertainty and how different groups will respond and how that'll change the nature of the relationship and so forth. So this is going to be a general claim, but that societies that are dominated by relationships as compared to markets are going to be less characterized by innovation. Okay? And because everything has to be then sorted through in some manner through the political process, puts a lot of pressure on the political process and therefore leads to more political instability. Now, so this is fine to talk about feudal and medieval periods or even 19th or early 20th century periods, but we're worldwide a dominantly urban population. Okay? So how does a study or emphasis on land ownership influence urban society? Now, it's a hard one, and I'm not even going to, there's no clear way for me to test this, but we're going to talk about this project we're engaged in. But nevertheless, past land ownerships set social, political, and economic positions. And that is if you own land and you're a big deal in the countryside and you migrate to cities, you're the one, you have the capital. You have the education, your children have the education and the capital. You're in a position to mold influence, okay?
When you put that first title up here, are you assuming that there is some difference in urban land ownership? It would seem to me the principles are the same.
I'm sorry?
It would seem to me the principles are the same.
They certainly can be, and I'd like to come back to these issues. Let me sort of slide my way through it. And that's actually the argument that I believe that we're making this the same. Okay, so if you owned land in the country and then you migrate to a growing urban area, you take that status those land rents, that position with you. And if you were a non-owner, an agricultural laborer or a serf or whatever, you take that plus limited human capital, education and so forth with you when you migrate to an urban area. And so already you have a more stratified society in an urban context that more reflects the stratified society that existed in the rural context. So I'm going to argue that they're not that separable, and we'll come back to that. And so this is quite different from a setting where the land was owned in small plots by lots of people. Okay, and we'll come back to some of those mechanisms in a moment. But when they migrate to cities, or their kids migrate to cities, it's quite a different bag of attributes they're going to be carrying with them. Higher higher human capital, more education, a sense of independence. They have grown up in a society where their ownership and their responsibility were important. And they actually, now this is just a point I make, and neither of my co-authors are sold on this, but we have lots of things that aren't out. But the point is, even this notion of American suburban ownership, where we have every house and a yard and this kind of stuff, that may be reflective of not only the fact that we have a lot of land, but the fact that, and we had access to land, but they're carrying a little bit of this farm ownership notion with you as compared to other places that I'll come back to. All in all, though, the way in which land was owned in a society can have lead to long-term differences in economic performance. Now, we're going to have to show a mechanism, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And they have long-term differences in expectations for social and economic mobility. I owned land, my family owned land, I migrated to the city, and it'll influence the kinds of investments that are made there, the kinds of production that goes up there, and the opportunities that are there. But they all link back to land ownership. And so what I want to do in this project is to compare, to be able to test some of these broad claims more precisely by looking at differences in land allocations in North and South America. Now, not for everybody, but for a huge number of people, the European discovery of the Western Hemisphere was incredible. I mean, there's just been nothing like it since. That is, you opened up essentially two continents of natural resources to another continent that already had been constrained in terms of access to resources and land, either physically or legally, politically. And this is opened up. And so this is an early map of North and South America from the 16th century, actually. And ultimately, the two continents are divided between England and Spain in terms of colonial policies and colonial ownership. Portugal and Brazil stand out, but not really, because it really mirrors the Spanish practice, okay? So if you take that away, and then there are these peripheral and short-lived claims by France and Sweden and the Netherlands, but you take those away, it's really England and Spain. So what does that mean in terms of colonial legacies and land ownership? Again, if you're from Mars, this is going to be, I want to sit around and watch this for a while, and you're going around the planet. They're both, North and South America, are settled by Europeans in different ways and different magnitudes, but about the same time. And yet, over that period, South America has emerged to be an underperformer. And I'll give you some suggested data on that, but it's non-controversial, really, I think. Even though both places have been loaded with natural resources. Okay? So they have this discovery, migration to similarly rich places, but very different outcomes. Now, just run by these. I mean, there are so many out here. You could pick whichever index you want to look at, but nevertheless, in 1800, these per capita measures, and these come from the World Bank, I believe, show, again, these are averages, okay, so, but nevertheless, in per capita terms, the U.S. stands out, Argentina already, and in Brazil and so forth. Now, there are some people that are doing very well, and some people not so well. But nevertheless, by 100 years later, you can see the U.S. and Canada. Argentina still stands out, and but not as, in Brazil and so forth. And then by the year 2000, you see this, even Argentina is performing as well. Venezuela, because they have all the oil wealth, and you can divide that across the population and get a high average. But nevertheless, the pattern that appears from this, I think, is that North America looks very different from the outcome, this particular outcome measure for South America. There are some other indicators. This is the rule of law, okay? Again, you get certain countries showing up as high on the indexes of rule of law. These are enforcement of contracts, property rights regimes, and so forth. And then you see really South America looking more like Africa in that regard, or Asia, but not at all looking like Europe in the way that North America does. Here is another index, and this is bureaucracy and corruption. I mean, these are all very hard to measure, but I don't think that the general patterns are that off the mark. Again, you have the US, Canada, Australia, Europe, and then, again, South America lagging behind. Okay, so what is this about these outcome variables? Lower economic performance, lower governance, more political instability. These differences naturally have attracted the attention of development economists and others to try, why does South America look so different from, and really Latin America from North America? And one of the strong claims is that the climate was different, okay, and that the disease environment really was not conducive to large-scale immigration in the way that North America was, with a more favorable disease environment, climate. Another popular argument is that the natural resource endowments were different, and natural resources that were tied to large-scale production. Okay? So it didn't really lend itself to small-scale allocations because these were sugar plantations or big gold mines and what have you. And then another one is the density of the native population in parts of Latin and South America. Native populations were dense, and they were hostile to immigrants, European immigrants. And that these exogenous factors, the disease, environment, climate, natural resource endowments, and native population really molded the property rights institutions and molded colonial policies, and then subsequently independence, and the policies followed after independence. These are really hard to test, and there have not been, so far as I'm aware, tests of these. In some ways, these are competing, but at least to separate out their differential contributions, there have really been no systematic empirical tests that I'm aware of. Even so, I've never found them that convincing. I'm not saying they're not important, because of course they are, but if you had a different property rights regime open to people in a different way, then you would have responded to these different factors differently, okay, than the way they did. Now, in the studies that we're engaged in, we try to avoid a lot of these confounding factors by looking at temperate regions that are comparable to temperate parts of the U.S. Okay? And so they are not characterized by large economies of scale. This would be the pampas of Argentina particularly. did not have dense native populations. In both cases, they're pretty much in the Midwestern US, as well as in Argentina, they're pretty much driven out, and so they're not there. And yet, they still lag, okay? Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile, they're relatively prosperous, but they're not North America. They're not the US and Canada. Okay? They have not been. So even if you focus, as we will, on these areas, they're not going to mirror North America. So here's where we come back to colonial legacies. And so I want to start here with just a quick overview of differences in the colonial legacy between England and Spain in terms of land ownership and distribution. In all places in Europe, as you know, land was owned by the creator, and the creator was represented by the sovereign. Okay? And the landed nobility effectively had use rights based on their ties to the sovereign. And then below all of that is the mass of the population that are serfs or peasants or later tenant farmers. They have little or no authority over the allocation, but the use of land or its sale, and they capture few land rents. Okay? Now, England stands out in the sense that among Western Europe, in that this feudal arrangement gets undermined pretty early. The Magna Carta, weakening the role of the sovereign versus the landed nobility. You get the Glorious Revolution of 1688. You get the rise of a merchant industrial class that often are quite separate from previous landowners. You get the enclosure movement, as controversial as it is, but basically it reconfigured the way in which land was owned and it was traded and so forth. It actually opened opportunities for much more small-scale farming and private farmers. And by the 17th century in England, there's actually a concern that they have too many people, okay? Because you're enclosing land, you're freeing up people, they're migrating to cities, they're working in weaving mills and so forth, textiles. But there are a lot of convicts, and so North America and then later Australia become opportunities to offload these folks. And also in England, you have a series of heterogeneous religious institutions that have weak ties to the landed nobility or to the sovereign. Okay? So all of these are underlay why we might think that English colonial policy would be quite different from what I'm now going to describe in a moment about Spain. There is at the same time, and certainly philosophically, a debate, not debate so much about incentives for investment or whatever, but debate about the role of individuals in owning land. Okay? And their stake in the society and the economy, there are a whole series of names here, and largely this debate takes place in England. Okay? But this does give a sense of the intellectual fervor that's underlying smallholders, yeoman farmers, how important they are, you know, and the role of individuals within them. And this is coming about the same time that North America is appearing on the horizon. And this enormous stock of land and natural resources, and how individuals might play into that.
Before you go on, do you have any opinion as to why there weren't similar philosophers in Spain?
Oh, well, here we are.
Oh, you're going to get
Yep. Now, I don't know exactly why they weren't, okay? But I do know that the structure of Spanish society and the economy is very different, okay? There is, so far as I'm aware, no intellectual or legal background for smallholders, okay? The crown remains dominant. You have a migrating grazing society with the landed elites having close ties not only to the crown, but also to the church. And that, in fact, the labor relations in agricultural production in Spain stay relatively stagnant until in the middle part of the 20th century. Okay? Maybe a part of the reason for the viciousness of the Spanish Civil War. But nevertheless, it's a very hierarchical society. Not saying that England wasn't hierarchical. It's just these differences in wealth distribution and ability to break into them is quite different. So land rights are held by hereditary elites in large allotments in Spain. And this gets translated into Spanish colonial policy. Okay? So the people that are granted access to land in South America are representatives of agricultural landowning elites in Spain. They're not usually the firstborn son, which is the way these primogeniture arrangements worked, but others who in the past would have had to gone into the clergy or whatever somehow now have this new opportunity. They can be big deals in South America and elsewhere. And so the land is granted early on by the crown, and these are use rights, and they can be revoked. And the power of sort of monitoring them arises from a viceroy in the major cities of Latin America and in South America. And then these are the important people, and they also turn out to be important in the post-colonial South America. So,
Gary, two quick questions or comments too. Is the first item, the comparable intellectual legal backgrounds, is that at all influenced by the Moorish?
well, yeah, I don't know to the degree to which it's influenced by the Moors or they're driving the Moors out. Because in the reconquest of Spain, of the Iberian Peninsula, essentially as you drove the Moors out, it opened up land. And there was this then allocation of land, as I understand it, to the large landed elites already in the northern parts of Spain.
And then the second question, the last kind of comments, that seems to be colonial policy for England in Western Canada. Rupert's land being given entirely to Hudson's Bay Company and the like, so you don't get the same kind of American or even.
Yeah, I'm sort of simplifying things. It is true that along the east coast of the U.S., and then as you move across New York State and, well, to some degree in Ohio, you do have allocations to large holdings. That's what George Washington and all these people. But they weren't there to hold land. They were speculators. And that's really important because the idea is you want to attract enough immigrants so you can sell land, and your position really is based on the sale of land and the wealth that generates. And that doesn't change, okay? That, as I'll describe in a moment.
I was thinking about the Canadian context.
Yeah.
Hudson's Bay was granted the entire western half of the northern part of North America in perpetuity.
Yeah. Couldn't last because Canada is in hot competition with the U.S. for the same immigrants. And so they really have to mirror U.S. allocation, land allocation, resource allocation systems in order to be competitive, and they are, okay, and they do. So I back, after all these years, back into literatures I don't know so well. But I love this phrase that comes out of Frederick Jackson Turner, who, I'm sure revisionist historians don't like, but nevertheless I think he captures a lot, that America was another word for opportunity. And that just has to be right. In other words, if you're a little person in Europe and suddenly, well, you have access to resources that you could never have had in Europe. Okay? And so you have this access to resources, and you're going to own it. So wealth, and you can move up in terms of social mobility. And there are, for a while this was quite an important topic in economic history, in American economic history, looking at the sources of wealth on the frontier. And when they talk about frontier, we're talking about Iowa, Illinois, and so forth, but so the Midwestern frontier. But basically, the major source of wealth, land exchange, land sales, and capturing the capital gains from that, okay? And then your children migrated on, and they did the same. And it's this story really of land speculation and trade that propels the wealth accumulation in North America. It also changes the way in which you want land demarcated and land rights demarcated. You want to make them easily divisible and sellable. You want boundaries to be clear. And so that's why the rectangular survey is put in so early with the Northwest Ordinance, I think. But even today, with things being quite different in the US and worldwide and so forth, America still remains a land of opportunity. Okay? It's still where, I could claim, and not just claim, but this is where most people would like to be, rather than in Germany or elsewhere, which is a tighter society, but if they could only get here. Now, and we'll come back to this at the end, because these are only thoughts I have about it, but it does suggest that today, as there seems to be, at least as you read in the press, more a greater reliance on the state, in a sense more pessimism, criticism of capitalism or whatever. I don't know what their alternative hypothesis is, but nevertheless, and it could be that this is due to the fact that more and more urban people have never had a tie to land ownership in the same way. Okay? And this does show up when you look at these purple versus red or whatever. You live in coastal California or parts of the coastal east. It's quite different than the flyover country. And there's no clear way for me right now to think about how to test it, but we can turn to a comparative analysis of land ownership in the US and Argentina. And that's what the rest of this is all about. As I mentioned earlier, again, now maybe it's growing up, we're not landowners, my family's pretty blue collar as you can get, but nevertheless, this whole notion of manifest destiny, it's not for everybody. A lot of people get squeezed out. I'm not going to deny that. But nevertheless, for a huge part of the population, the European-based population, this continent of land and other related resources, and their ability to claim it and own it and participate in the wealth generated from it, just a magnificent legacy. And I will not say that I've read everything in Argentina. There's a huge literature that I'm not going to know, or Chile or Uruguay. But there's just nothing like this in that historiography. There's just no sort of bounded or unbounded optimism that you find in these historical studies. So let's look at these differences in North America. And again, these are going to be, in a way, caricatures, because they're not going to cover a lot of things, such as Ross mentioned, but nevertheless, remarkably similar, going from even the colonial period forward. You get small farm distributions, especially in the north. Okay? Whether these are formalized, and they are, as they become formalized through the Homestead Act after 1862, but even before, if large land companies, the Ohio Land Company, 3 million acres or something they purchase from Congress, and what do they do with it? They break it up and sell it. Okay? So it wasn't holding on to land that was the source of influence and wealth, but selling it. Okay. Even with mineral resources, these are small distributions. Now later they become more capital intensive, but you own mineral rights in this country, or have, and it gives different incentives for exploration and production, And there's active trade in stock markets, in the Comstock lode in San Francisco, or in Northern California and so forth, of shares owned in these mines. Even if you were no longer out there panning gold, you can own a share in the company that actually was engaged in more capital intensive. So that's why I've been skeptical on these notions that the resource endowment alone would determine how a resource could be owned. Also, there appears to be an active participation in land and capital markets. Now, speculation in itself suggests active participation. Okay? What is harder for me, and I'm sort of surprised to link this to capital market development, because if you earn rents from the sale of land, what do you do with that stuff? Well, you invest it, okay? That stuff meaning the rents that you've earned when you sell the land, the capital gains. Well, that's got to be a source of capital market infusion in Chicago and other Midwestern cities and so forth. So I'm sort of surprised I'm having trouble finding that literature, but that does characterize U.S. economic history, active participation in land and capital markets, even though documenting it is more limited. And it's these land sales that really determine, and the wealth they generate, determine who the important people are in little towns. Okay? These are the people that made their wealth in the sale of land or off the resources from land that actually become important people in, like Missoula, where I now live, but Salt Lake City and Denver and so forth. Okay? But when you own land in small plots, or own land in particular, and its primary role is production and the wealth that generates and then your ability to sell it, then you'll be very attuned to differences in production, potential and possibilities based on what the market is signaling with regards to crops, and farm size. So if farms turn out to be too small, you buy your neighbors. Okay? Or if they're too large, you break them up. Okay? And so this leads to differences in incentives for land quality and production methods, the rapid adoption of harvesting technologies and so forth. Importantly, it also leads, and this actually has been documented, investment in education. Okay? So farmers in the upper Midwest wanted to ensure that their children could read seed catalogs and would be able to read about the new market information about relative prices of barley versus oats versus different kinds of wheat and so forth, and where new, often from the Ukraine, where new types of wheat seed that seem to be particularly important to use in North America with this, in many places, challenging climate where these could be adopted. So you have a highly educated labor force, and it's also managed locally, okay, by local school boards, and they invest in it. They hire the teachers and all this kind of stuff. And this is what we're not going to see so much in South America. But moreover, there are some other important ways to look at this. Migration to North America, largely by families from the very beginning. Okay? So these are people who are planning to come and stay, and they came often as indentured servants to pay for their transport and their family's transport. When their indenture period is released, often as part of that contract, they were given access to land and the title to land. Okay? So this became a very, there's a competitive pressure for these people and get them into your part of North America. So we get migration by families. So the female to male ratio, which I'll show you in a moment, is much higher in North America than even in Argentina. Also, because you have family settlement and small farms, and the small farms, of course, have to be viable. If they're not, then they're going to gradually become larger. But even so, you get dense rural communities, and this creates a relatively large internal market. Okay? It's going to influence investments from urban settings and where they focus. And again, the market is more important than the state. And you probably are aware that the federal government doesn't become important relative to state and local until the 1930s. Okay? So for a good hunk of American economic history, it's state and local governments, school boards and things like that, that are the most important for locals, and not the federal government in any important redistribution programs. There's optimism, there's relative egalitarianism, especially early on, because land is allocated in the way that it was. Now, it is true that as the second round of migrants come in and they have to buy the land, well, they're going to be relatively poorer than the people that just sold it to them. And so that this egalitarian measure, which some indicate that the American frontier was the early frontier was the most egalitarian place on the planet where we have data. But nevertheless, it isn't a sense of injustice so much as a sense of opportunity, okay? And an important, legitimate notion of opportunity. And this, I think, underlies this notion of political stability. The state isn't where you turn. It's not that very big to begin with. And secondly, it's the market. It's access. So it's internal migration patterns. This is just reminding you what the middle part of the country looks at. A colleague of mine and I have looked at why this is put into place. Seems like a pretty costly way to stamp the whole country into squares. But in fact, we estimated that land in squares is about 25% greater in value than absolutely similar land adjacent to it. And we have a nice test area in Ohio where it's called the Virginia Military District that was given to Virginia, and it's all meets and bounds, which is the old way in which you demarcate land based on topography or trees or rocks, all the things that can change, as compared to this rigid squares that don't change because they're tied to latitude and longitude. And we get more land sales, fewer land conflicts, and so forth. Now, so let's look at Spain and South America. Well, first off, Spain discouraged immigration, especially by small people, because they were tied to the agricultural labor force. It was more serf-like or more feudal-like than in England and parts of Northern Europe, to support grazing and just the social structure that was in place in the Iberian Peninsula. So that becomes important. So the people that migrate are primarily, early on, are these landed nobility or parts of the landed nobility. Now later on, we'll see that you do get immigration, rural immigration, but it's primarily from Spain and Italy, and it's often seasonal, which is kind of remarkable if you think about going all the way across, but nevertheless, seasonal migration. We do have some data on that. The land distribution and production is characterized by this Roman term, latifundia, where basically you have the owners, the large land of the large landed estates, and then an agricultural labor force. And later you have tenancy, which and tenancy contracts, which I think are more important. I'm not sure how we're going to get the data necessarily. But all this means there are less incentives to invest in education. It leads to lower human capital, especially as these people migrate into the cities. Because you're hiring a labor force. They're not owners. They're not your kids and so forth necessarily. And you're not wanting them to leave. And they're not reading seed catalogs or new innovations or so forth. They're labor. And they're separate from you. And so this leads to a different way in which agriculture is organized. I'll show you, I think I kept the slide in, but basically until the early 20th century, rural agriculture to rural areas in Argentina is dominantly male, and it often is seasonal, and so it's quite different. You get a much less dense much less dense frontier settlement, and there are data on this. So that means there's going to be a much smaller internal market to devote production towards. Less investment in land and new production methods and seeds. What we're actually looking at, where we can get data, is whether farm sizes are importantly different from certain parts of the pampas and certain parts of the U.S. Midwest, as well as central Texas. And what we're finding, we have only relatively few Argentine censuses to work from, but nevertheless, what we find is controlling for climatic and terrain differences and prices, that farms stay too large, too long in Argentina relative to the U.S., and that they shift into grains later. Okay, and Argentina becomes a booming grain producer, but they may have given up this wealth or some of this wealth because they didn't shift into it earlier. Okay, and for immigrants, there's really no clear way, by and large, for them to get access to land. They can be agricultural laborers, they can be tenant farmers. So they don't have collateral, they don't have ownership that allows them to, and as many do, migrate to Buenos Aires or urban areas. And as I just said, these same very hierarchical patterns mirror migration to urban areas. These are some areas we're trying to explore for mechanisms, but it certainly seems clear that the human capital, the educational level of migrants moving from rural to urban, as compared to from rural parts of the Midwest to Chicago, quite different, and they have lower real wages, and the kinds of production that they migrate into is quite different from the U.S. Okay? So if you move to Buenos Aires as compared to moving to Chicago, you migrate into different production possibilities. And the agricultural gentry really determine this. They know what they know. And so they really emphasize export base of agricultural products. I'm not saying export base wasn't important in a place like Argentina, but nevertheless, there doesn't seem to be a broad spectrum of investments. And as a consequence, it's both export base and then import substitution. They have a small internal market, so to supply that internal market, they can't really compete with the US and Europe, so they restrict entry with tariffs put into place very early on. And this skewed distribution of wealth continues that we saw in the rural areas into the urban ones. And so periodically, people become very unhappy about this, and we have all of the political instability that we characterize with South America in general, in Argentina in particular. This is just to give you a sense of the haphazard nature of land grants. Ironically, this is from California, but I couldn't find a good picture of Argentina, but nevertheless, it gives you a sense that these are not square plots. If you look at what the Ohio company got, for example, it's a big rectangle, and then it's parceled out. And there are also similar plots where large ones are given in the U.S. But by and large, after that, it's these small distributions and small homestead distributions. So for this comparison, U.S. and Argentina, they look very similar. Let's see, am I chewing more of my time? They have, at least for parts of the U.S. and parts of Argentina, quite similar. Arable land, the distribution of arable land across the population. Okay. We also have information on precipitation, soil quality, terrain, and so forth. So we can really zero in on places, growing seasons and so forth that are quite comparable. This gives you some data back on what I mentioned earlier on just outcomes. Per capita income over time for the parts, primarily the parts of South America that really extrapolate away from these other exogenous factors. But you can see that for much of the time period early on, because these are so rich in resources, they're quite similar. But then the U.S. just really starts to take off relative to. Now these are averages, so we got the hierarchical folks, the upper end of that, tied in with within the people of the lower end. And if you look at wealth distribution measures, Gini coefficients, the U.S. gives you far more egalitarian distributions of wealth than you find in any of these other more temperate areas. This gives you a sense of the seasonal nature of migration. People come to North America, and many do return, but most don't. Okay? But that doesn't characterize Argentina, for example. Early on, you get immigrants, and then you have people moving out. Okay? Now, there are times when they don't, depending on how bad things are in Spain or Italy. This is primarily where these come from. But nevertheless, these tend to be seasonal migrants. They don't bring their wives and children. They come to work and then to move back. This gives you a notion of the ratio of male to female. And you see it's much higher in Argentina all through the period where we have data, the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th. Now, after you get about 1910, most immigration into Argentina is urban. Okay? People aren't migrating into rural areas, so we're not looking at the same patterns any longer. This gives you a sense of human capital investment across these temperate countries, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, as compared to the U.S. Look at literacy rates. Let's just take literacy rates in 1900 or close to 1900, about 52%. Now, this is going to be urban and rural. That's all we have right now. But in 1900, 43%, Chile, 52% in Argentina. If you look at Canada, 81 to 90%. When you look at whites in the U.S., over 90%. Now, as you might expect, blacks don't fare as well. But the point is that you get lower levels of literacy, at least in part due to less incentive to invest in human capital in Argentina as to the much more well-documented incentives to invest in human capital in North America, in North American rural areas. These are, again, I'm trying to find sort of more quantitative ways to get at political participation. So these are participation at all levels of government. And basically, again, the U.S. outperforms. The participation rates are low, okay? But then, as I said earlier, government just didn't matter very much in North America as compared to South America, but for most of the population, it can't vote, and I'll show you why in a moment. And this changes by 1950 when it becomes, far more urban in Argentina, but also you get a shift in political regimes. Here's some more data on political participation, just the requirements to vote, lack of voting secrecy, wealth requirements, literacy requirements, and overall percentage voting. Again, if you go back to, let's say, 1916 in Argentina or 1896, you have a relatively small portion of the population voting. This is the period that we have the most data for, that we're most interested in, the latter part of the 19th, early 20th century. But you see, because of these requirements on literacy and wealth and so forth, you get quite a limited portion of the population that votes. You skip to, let's find a comparable area, time in Canada. You have wealth requirement, but nevertheless you get a far greater portion of the population voting. You skip to approximately the same time in the U.S., very similar. But we don't have wealth or secrecy concerns, we do have literacy requirements that vary by state, okay? But this it gives you a sense of why land ownership differences could matter and how they might have long-term implications for economic outcomes. So this is a colonial origins argument about the distribution of the land, and that this carries over. This is the part we can make the weakest arguments about, but they carry over into an urban setting. And it affects this. We can document better human capital accumulation for labor force participation and wages and expectations, the size of the domestic market, and so forth. So these are long-term effects, I think, that can be traced back to the original land allocation system, molded by England on the one hand, or Spain on the other hand, and that these set up differences in expectations about the ownership of land and the incentives that provides, and the notions of independence, of responsibility, and really optimism with regards to mobility and changing your lot in life as well as your children's lot in life, that are so seemingly so different between otherwise very similar parts of South America and North America. So that is my overview, and took, not surprisingly, I guess, took longer than I anticipated, but I'm now open for all sorts of questions that you might have. Thank you.
I'll just go ahead and talk loud. It's our tradition to start with the question period with questions from students first, if they would like to ask questions. So if there's any students in the room who want to ask a question, please go ahead. Otherwise, we'll turn to others. Go ahead.
What role do different indigenous populations in either North America or South America play on the distribution of property, and how that
In the indigenous,
affecting the different outcomes?
Had to be important.
Can you just repeat that?
He's asking about the role of indigenous populations, and that had to be important given the way indigenous populations were viewed in actually both places. Because I think it's so complicated, that's why let's look at a place, because all of South America underperforms. So I'm not going to answer your question that well, but let's look at a place where the indigenous densities are not that different, and that's Argentina. For many of the same reasons that they're not that different in the central part of North America. But it didn't have to be. If you're from Mars and you were allocating land rights and you weren't sort of concerned about whether people were natives or Europeans or whatever, it could have been different. But clearly the way in which land, it is often stated that because the indigenous parties did not have apparently clear property rights or didn't occupy the land all the time, that it was really open for claiming. That's a very European notion, at least a Northern European notion. I don't know the degree that it had this same carryover in South America, but their indigenous peoples are quickly, in a sense, coerced or enslaved into the labor force. But because it's so complicated, if we can't show it in Argentina, why these places are going to work, it's going to even be harder elsewhere. Question,
Joe.
I have a question regarding the nature of how the particular political regimes of these countries could have impacted their ability to succeed, because I can't help but think of, by comparison, Argentina's northern neighbor, Brazil, had its comparative height under Pedro II. It was a semi-constitutional monarchy. That was a system of government that seemed to work rather well for Brazil, and then following subsequently turn over to a democracy that there was a military movement in practice, Brazil started to once again fall back into the stunted growth. So it could also be that there's a misalignment between the cultural mores of the people of South America and their respective regimes, that perhaps maybe these kind of idealistic democracies were just not fit for people who then came from these kind of more feudalistic societies.
Yeah. Well, in the same spirit that I answered the last question, I'm just going to punt a bit. I don't know. Everything I have read on Brazilian development is that it underachieves from the very get-go, and that Portuguese colonial policy did not stray that much from Spanish, as, for all the reasons you can imagine. Land allocations were large. Early on, it's sugar, so you have this notion of high of economies of scale and large plantation agriculture. So I don't know. Well, I don't know that early pre-independence Brazil was such.
Well,
things
that's
were
why
so.
my question is the primary concern with the post-independence regime.
Yeah.
That once again, that's why I mentioned Brazil, the Brazilian Empire, as opposed to Portuguese.
I don't know. Certainly, what I do know more about Spanish America is that the same elites that owned land become the same elites that dominate the political structure. And that, I think, is more understandable than a shift that I thought you suggested. There are parts of Brazil that, as in some parts of Argentina where we're doing within-country comparisons, where you do get small-scale agriculture allocations in the south and in parts of the pampas in Argentina. So we have an opportunity there. But these are going to be experiments as compared to a general policy and a general flow of immigrants.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
I think I skimmed the Jared Diamond book, Collapse, a number of years ago. And I can't remember very much of it, but I do remember that he proposed in it that ease of travel and topography, there was a lot of geological differences that in between the North and South America that basically was really fundamental in development. And I agree with your concluding remarks and everything, but I'm wondering what your thoughts on some of those ideas are.
Sure. Yeah, that's another good question. It's clear that the Andes and then the more tropical parts of the north, and then even today, the Amazon is still difficult to access, although roads are in the Brazilian side. Argentina, by the latter part of the 19th century, had the densest railroad network in the world, largely built by British capital. But it all radiated from Buenos Aires to hit stuff there, mostly agricultural exports. So those all have to be important. But again, what I was saying is try to get around a lot of these exogenous, geographic, disease, native density, population arguments. If you were to look at Argentina, Chile, Uruguay today, if those were the dominant explanatory factors, then they all look like the U.S., Canada, but they don't. And so we don't have, they're flat, but not southern Chile and so forth, but parts of flat. But certainly Argentina's flat, most of it. Much of Brazil's flat. And yet they underperform. So that's why we're focusing on Argentina, and that's why I'll keep coming back, because I know more about that than I do other places. And transportation costs have long been an argument in the economics and historical literature as to why these places have developed more slowly, but it doesn't really explain Argentina. They have trains, had trains pretty much everywhere.
Other questions? Yeah.
I want to inquire about whether there's an optimal amount of government land ownership, and I want to compare it to taxation. Most economists argue for lower taxes as being more productive, but not very many argue for zero taxes. So when you talk about land ownership, is there an optimal amount of land to be owned collectively by the government?
Well, I don't have an answer to that. So I'm kind of consistent with all of my answers here. But on the other hand, so in part of that would have to be a cost-benefit, it would seem to me. What does the state use that revenue for? That if there are any downside incentive effects, or in terms of the way in which land is used and used, if it's owned by the state, and then what the state does with that revenue. If the state provides public goods that otherwise wouldn't be provided, and so forth, well, then I think you could have an argument. And then you expand the size of state ownership of land, you look at what you might lose, because I think you can make arguments that politicians with short-term time horizons are not going to be so attuned to market signals and productive practices. I mean, we've sort of been there in a way with the Soviet Union. In the collectivization, and even today in China, individual agricultural plots cannot be traded, and so they're much more restricted. So the ownership of land has been central to the way in which governments have operated for a long time. But anyway, that's the way I don't work in taxation and so forth, so I don't have a good answer there for that reason either. But I think it would be a cost-benefit trade-off if the state, as you get a downside from state ownership, and there's a more than disproportionate boost in what the state does with those revenues in terms of the provision of public goods. There may be studies out there in that, but I'm not familiar with them.
I have a question on the far side over here.
Yeah.
I'm interested in you elaborating on the land tenure.
On the what?
Land tenure issue. We had, as you know, debates in late classical economics over Irish land tenure. You touched upon the fact that Hispanic America had basically use rights in land, but not fee simple. But then the topic kind of got dropped, and from my perspective at least, it seems to be a central topic.
What, the movement from use rights to more formal tenure?
The difference, the contrast of performance that you get under a pure use right system, which you indicated seemed to be true in Latin America at one point anyway, was true in Ireland at one point, to a fee simple system, which generally has been true of Anglo-American areas. I mean, back 40 years ago when I did some of this stuff, that was a hot issue.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. I'm sorry, again, it is certainly true that under colonial Spanish policies, you had a use right.
Okay.
You did not have title. Now, after the Spanish sovereign is gone, title does not revert to the state.
Okay.
It remains, so there's a process there that it goes to, you now have a land owning elite instead of a landed elite.
Let me put the question differently.
I'm sorry?
Let me put the question differently. In Mexico, which I know something about,
Okay.
they have a notarial system. There's not a central
Yeah.
land deed
Yeah,
register. You have to find
Right.
a notary, and he
Right,
makes a
right.
notation.
And that's all over, actually, that's all over much of the world, but certainly Latin
Do you
America.
think that's a factor in underdevelopment?
I don't know. So those are hard to test. That's why we're looking at, we're right now looking at farm size and not adjusting at the time that they shifted into grain. So it's going to be a major leap from the period you're interested in. They already have title, the large landowners. They don't, you're right. Yeah, it's different, yeah. And there actually is a pretty high, well, at least there is a literature on the relative merits of sort of relying upon notaries as compared to title and these deep common law title searches and so forth as compared to the notary put more through the civil law. I don't know how important in the big scheme of things that turns out to be. There's some people argue it's big. I've just never seen numbers to kind of compare them. But it does see, for example, in this issue of shift to grains. Now, Argentina becomes the world's largest grain exporter, I think, by 1910 or by 1920. Okay? Greater than the U.S. Now, a lot of us gets consumed in the U.S., but nevertheless. So they get there eventually. But in the U.S., the shift to grains the decision to shift to grains is made by owner-operators, okay? And so somebody has read or been told that prices are going up for grains relative to livestock or other kinds of crops, okay? And so this decision is made, these are managed by, in a sense, firm/farm models. And my children, there's no labor force here, your children are out there and they're looking for the best harvesting equipment and so forth and so on. In Argentina, at least, this is a different setting. You have large land-owning estates, and you have a lot more, by this time, tenant farmers. And it appears that they have about 3-year tenant contracts. Now, I don't know what happens after 3 years, but what you read in the histories, these qualitative histories, is that you don't know. You're a tenant farmer, you don't know if it'll be renewed, okay? So you have lower levels of human capital by design, okay? But moreover, you have less incentive because you don't know if you're going to be around there that long. And the landed elites have to manage all these people as compared to their kids in the U.S. And so you could predict that the response to these market signals responses are going to be made more rapidly in a smallholder allocation than in a large one. That's hard for us because we have 3 census periods in Argentina to pull these data from. And whereas the U.S. we have a much richer set and so forth. So we can describe more about tendency and response in the U.S., I think, which is an area we're just now starting to explore. But it would suggest that Argentina is going to come to this late. Now, it doesn't mean they give it up forever, but there would be a gap of lost wealth by sticking to livestock, for example, too long. And if this is descriptive of the society and the economy, then it could explain underperformance, even where the native densities are not important.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, great. So I was really interested in the story you told about human capital and education as part of this. And I thought you did a really nice job of laying out from the demand side for education in North America about how a group of relative smallholders will have a clear demand for education.
Yeah.
I thought maybe what was maybe missing here was a little bit of the story about how that was created, how there was actually a supply of opportunity for education that did have, sort of community and local and state government involvement as that frontier advanced, in the sense that these communities did ultimately, Abraham Lincoln, classic, schoolhouse kind of examples. They engaged in collective action to provide these opportunities as well. And so I'm curious if you could comment then on sort of the supply side, and you started to earlier, about how that differed in South America by virtue of the very hierarchical structure.
So I'm just getting in this literature, but Peter Linder, who you know, at UC Davis, and a co-author, have looked at the census supply of education. And this is primarily New England and then northern Midwestern. That's where they get their data from. So I don't know if exactly what it means elsewhere. But what they find is that these school boards are dominated by locals, local landowners. Okay, and these are fragmented smallholders. Okay, and that basically they're involved in the hiring of these teachers and monitoring what was taught. And they want literacy, they want sort of the classical education, but they want math. Okay. So they want people to be able to be responsive to market signals. Beyond the high school education, this is not so important. Now, I didn't show these data, but you get this blossoming in these same places of all of these liberal arts colleges, often religious ties. And so this is to sort of augment the more utilitarian nature of education at the local level. And so there's demand if you want to be an educated person, but you're already wealthy enough to actually send your children there, so they can go to and it is astounding at how many, if you count all these institutions that are now, of course, in trouble in some cases, but nevertheless how that rises. There's nothing comparable in Argentina. So we just don't find many universities in Argentina not only supplying a classical education, but doing extension work and experiment station work after the Morrill Act in the US in 1862 that really charged them with looking for, if there hadn't been a political demand for that, we wouldn't have done it, okay? So extension, and ASU has been a leader in that for a long time. So finding out what farmers need to know. Now we might view that more skeptically now, but nevertheless at this time for sure it's important.
I'm fascinated by the contrast between North and South America, but I'm going to ask a question
that
focuses on North America and maybe even more specifically the Midwest. I'm just wondering if you might comment on implications for small farms, small family farms in the U.S. and kind of this shift towards larger corporate farms.
Yes. Yeah.
And whether or not kind of the implications for that mindset that you talked about of being part of something bigger than oneself, has this kind of led to stagnant wages, withering of small towns in the Midwest, opioid addiction, loss of optimism, all of that?
No, I can't do that. But actually, I think they're suggestive. Now, this notion of corporate farms versus industrial, I mean, these things are thrown around a lot and, in a pejorative way. But farms have been consolidating really since the 1930s as economies of scale have shifted, as the kinds of agricultural innovations, harvesting equipment. Back to Josh's notion of this kind of community, a long time ago we did look at where cooperatives, because they're a big push in the 20s that bring small farms together into cooperatives, by and large did not do very well. Was my memory of that study. In part because they only work in certain kinds of commodities, and if you have mixed production, then it's not so much, they're not so effective. But as the reason for small town, you had a dense local population and you had higher transportation costs, and you aggregated local production to ship out and things like that. You had local schools and local towns and whatever. Their reasons for being there no longer exist. Now, I don't know, of course, I grew up in one of those kinds of towns and so forth, but I don't know that there's a lot of welfare loss with the decline of small farm towns. And there may not be, there would be welfare loss in terms of productive unit if we somehow constrained. You just get around it, and we have these 160-acre constraints on irrigation access and so forth. All sorts of ways to get around it. So it's clear that agriculture has changed. What I'm arguing is that, at least for a large part of American economic development history, it molded the way in which people thought about themselves and their ability to buy into it and be part of it in a way that's just not existent, even in Argentina, because they never have that. And I think, and this we're still trying to figure out how to deal with this, but I think it molded the way in which investments were made in terms of local production Is local production going to be primarily based on the protection from imports, okay, which those small market countries were, didn't have to be, Britain wasn't, and also export based. That's what the landowners did. Now maybe that's what you would have done anyway, the processing of hides and then later refrigerated beef and then later into grains. Maybe that's what you would have done in any event, you know, but you didn't know about other things, like something that would attach to or improve upon imports from England or the US or whatever, make it more specific to the Argentine market, because it really wasn't a rural Argentine market. It was an urban market. And so what, at least for Brazil, back to your question, the argument for Brazil is that Brazil, there's more history on that it remained far too focused on export base for too long. It's a big country, and so they really could have had a much more market developed much more similarly to what the US did.
Let's thank our speaker for.
Thank you.